Good evening, everyone. Perhaps like me, you are trying to think about and hope about the election and our country at this time. And I am very grateful that Pastor Amy Reumann is with us. She is the executive for Witness in Society for the ELCA. I came to know Pastor Reumann when she was an assistant to the bishop in Milwaukee, and I was a seminary professor in Chicago, and we talked about preaching. And I've experienced her in this role, in her current role, as I visited DC, and I was both impressed and grateful. So I expect to learn much, and I hope you will too. Let us pray. Almighty and merciful God, in baptism, you join us to Jesus' death and resurrection, claiming us as your children, heirs of your promise, and servants of all. We thank you for the gift and privilege of sharing the promise and serving our neighbor in this election year. Bless Pastor Amy in her teaching and us in her learning, in our learning, that together we may know your will and calling, and then by the power of your Spirit, give us the grace, the patience, and the courage to pursue it. In Jesus Christ, our Savior and Lord. Amen. Welcome, Pastor Reumann.
Thank you, Bishop, for your warm welcome. And hello, friends in Christ, neighbors, colleagues, disciples, and all of us who are gathering for this topic and this time. I'll say a few words first of self-introduction, tell you a little bit about what I do, and then our goals for this session. And after we go through our content today, we'll also look ahead at some of the others. I am joined by Karen Krieger, who is our Program Director for Advocacy Engagement in the ELCA, and she is in charge of slides. So Karen, you can just get the first title one up. And as she does, I'll tell you a few things about myself. The first is that I am an ELCA pastor. I have served in urban contexts, rural contexts, suburban context, and as Bishop Satterley said, as assistant to the bishop in the Greater Milwaukee Synod. But my two most recent calls have been related to advocacy, because every call that I've had, there's been a need for the church to speak and witness publicly. And so that has been my experience in parish ministry, in synod staff, and then later at Lutheran Advocacy Ministry in Pennsylvania, one of the state public policy offices of the ELCA. And now for the last 8 years, I've been in Washington, D.C. As part of the ELCA federal policy team, as well as working with the four institutional expressions of our public witness. So the federal work, which is probably what most people are most aware of and acquainted with. We also maintain a network of state public policy offices, currently in 17 states, not Michigan, alas. We also have an office that is a partnership with the Lutheran World Federation at United Nations headquarters in New York. And then we do corporate social responsibility, which is working with corporations for shareholder advocacy. And we will be actually joined by our Director for Corporate Social Responsibility at a later time to learn a little bit about that work. For myself, in addition to having been a parish pastor, I am a member now of Christ Lutheran Church in Washington, D.C., and I am this year council president. So to all the council presidents out there, I say thank you, thank you, thank you. When I was a parish pastor, I did not know how much wonderful work that is, but that is something that I enjoy. I am also a spiritual director. I am a master gardener, and I work at a nearby urban farm, helping with the intern program and teaching agricultural methods there. And then I have two daughters, both of them in college, one just off to her first year 2 weeks ago. So that is me, and that is also a bit about the vocation that I've been called to, where The Witness in Society team serves this church to support your advocacy, both on issues, but this year in particular, on election years, the interest in civic engagement and helping to support and lead that work. So for our session today, I have a couple goals for us. The first is to spend some time exploring our theological foundations as Lutherans for discipleship in a democracy, and the responsibility that comes out of that, our understanding of God and service to neighbor, to seek the common good. We are going to take a little break from some of that then, or build upon it, let's say. And I've invited a friend of ours, Ms. Autumn Byers, is going to, as a young adult, have a conversation with her about the importance of civic engagement for young adults seeking and serving through faith communities. And maybe how some of these avenues for discipleship you could consider as you consider your congregational engagement. We're then going to get to some of the how-tos. And as you're looking at your election year work, we're now at the beginning of September. How do we engage in a nonpartisan way and in legal ways in our civic engagement before, during, and after an election? So to give some guidelines for that, and then point you to several resources that you may want to consider for your work this year. So that's what we hope to do, and to do it in the next 45, 50 minutes, but have plenty of times for questions, follow-up, and consultation. Okay, friends, here we go. Next slide, please. When we talk together as Lutherans about witnessing to Christ and loving our neighbor, we are affirming that this is a vocation we have. It's not something that we do just in election year. However, it's something we're called to do all time, witness to Christ and love our neighbor. But in an election year, as we are in now, and there's something about coming out of Labor Day and realizing the campaigns, local, state, national, are really heating up, we have a heightened awareness and questions maybe about how to conduct ourselves, questions about how do we express our faith in public, while we discern, pray, and make choices as individuals and communities about candidates, issues, and the big decisions in front of us. But before going right there, let's start with a vision, which is God's vision for us and for all creation. And that vision can be summed up in the single Old Testament word, shalom. You're probably familiar with that, and know that most often shalom is translated as peace. But when you unpack it, the word means much, much more. Shalom is actually the fullness, the breadth, the depth of what God wants out of love for all of creation. Shalom is about God's intention that there be abundance, an abundance of peace, of well-being, of goodness, of truth, of beauty, justice, freedom, joy, the list goes on, wholesomeness, love, all of this, all woven together. And shalom is where we come from in creation. It's where we've started in the garden. And it's also the vision for where we are going. And it's what we strive for in our human community. Now, most of us, when we're asked to describe what we want out of life, shalom isn't necessarily a word that we reach for in everyday language, but it echoes through when we talk about civic life, our life in public. And so it's hidden behind phrases like the well-being of all or the common good. Shalom is in there, and that we can use earthly means towards God's intention. So if you know how to use your little hands up function, put your hand up if you've seen this painting before. And I'll bet quite a few have. For those who are in the know or not, this is called The Peaceable Kingdom. It's by an American folk artist named Edward Hicks, who lived 1780s to 1850 or so, 1849. And he was also a minister in the Society of Friends, also called the Quakers. And this picture exemplifies his religious ideas, and it's his attempt to capture in one painting the state of shalom, of peace, of nonviolence, and of wholeness. And so he drew on Isaiah chapter 11, where the children, where the lion and the lamb are lying together with one another. The predators have given up eating meat and they're all eating hay, and even the child can play with snakes without harm. And even in this very romanticized vision of shalom, there's even in the back a recognition that sometimes political negotiation helps to make things, help to achieve harmony. And so Hicks included his version of the original indigenous people meeting with settlers of Pennsylvania, led by Quaker William Penn, negotiating a treaty. So my question, next slide, please. So my question is, do you have an image of shalom or well-being or wholeness for yourself? It probably doesn't look like Edward Hicks, but you may have a vision of what you want for yourself, for your community, and how you would define it, as well as for our nation, moving into an election year where we make decisions about abundance, well-being, wholeness, peace, plenty, sharing, and all the rest. Do you have a vision for the community that you want, not just for you, but for the next generation and the generation after? These questions are faith questions that ask us to say, what does God want for us and for our lives? But these also become political questions about the kind of future we can help construct through our discipleship, the way you may choose this year to volunteer or serve or even vote in the public square. What I want to say is shalom is not simple, and shalom is never easy. Because Edward Hicks painted not one version of peaceable kingdom, not 5, not 10, but 62 versions of this one composition, each a little bit different, with different things in the background, different negotiations and decisions being made, different beasts lying and nuzzling and eating together, seeking to really find a way to picture this elusive harmony. And we know that shalom is elusive. Only to look at the back of that painting to the treaty being signed by William Penn and the indigenous inhabitants. It may have brought some peace and plenty to these settlers, but we know that this and other treaties cemented grave injustices, removed people or drove them from their ancestral lands, and impoverished and imperiled indigenous communities right up to this day. So shalom, when we as Lutherans look at it, we know that it cannot be determined only by those who have power, but that it has to recognize and include those with least standing or respect, and that we act accordingly. Next slide. Our other piece of theological grounding comes from the affirmation. The scriptures say that human beings are made in the image of God, right? The imago Dei, it's called in Latin, which is shorthand for saying that all of our beautiful human diversity is a reflection of God's being, and that God's purpose for humankind is that each of us carry and share that dignity ourselves and recognize it in the others and treat them accordingly. And this teaching about imago Dei, about the image of God, illustrates that human beings are created for relationship. Right? Just as the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit is God in relationship with God's self, so humans are also always in God-giving relationship with God and each other from the very moment of our creation. So being made in the image of God is about more than how we look, right? It's the gift of a vocation to participate in God's work of creation, of fostering shalom, to creating well-being in our social communities, in our political lives and choices, and in care of the earth. So Genesis tells that God created humans to till and keep the soil in the garden, so that from the very beginning, humans have a job to do together, to cooperate, to be in conversation, to coordinate our efforts for the good of all. And that's part of our teaching as a church too. We teach and celebrate that we live in relationship, and the image of God in us is what drives us towards that. So as we move into our thinking and our conversation about civic engagement these next weeks, let's keep in mind the grounding and the goal of shalom. And as humans made in the image of God, we are called into relationship to help bring this about and reflect it. Next slide, please. So at this time in the ELCA, we have we look to our social teaching documents to help guide us in our civic engagement, in our life in common. And whether you serve in a food pantry or donate to Lutheran disaster response or write a letter to a member of Congress, all of this is about helping to create those pieces of shalom and mirroring God's image. Today, for the foundation of what we're exploring, we're going to draw on ELCA social teaching. And we'll have session 3 where we'll get much deeper into our social teaching documents about the policy that sets for our church and the guidance in public affairs. And so today we're drawing primarily on our government and civic engagement in the United States, discipleship and democracy document. There'll be a link to that at the end. But I also want to draw your attention that as a church, we're in the middle of a much larger project, a statement on civic life and faith is still open for study and feedback through the end of September. And all the feedback that comes to it, that you can study yourself and do it online or do it as a congregation or community, all of that will then be considered into a draft that will eventually make its way to the next churchwide assembly next summer for adoption by the ELCA. Next slide, please. So what is civic engagement? Let's unpack that for a minute. So this series takes place in an election year. We want to offer support and guidance, but to just focus on elections misses the larger place of perhaps election and voting work and turning out the vote in civic engagement and the life of discipleship, which is every day and all the time. Here's something that our social message says about it. ELCA social teaching holds that all residents of the United States have a responsibility to make government function well, not to abandon our democracy, but to engage it in a spirit of robust civic duty. For Lutherans, this responsibility is lived out as a calling from God, expressed in the discipleship described in our baptismal promises. It is based on our understanding of how God governs human society. So let's unpack this full sentence for a minute. First, it's saying all residents, so that we're called to civic engagement, yes, as citizens, but also as people who vote or who don't vote yet, as residents, as adults, as young people, and people of every life stage. All residents have this calling as part of their faith. And this is very different, of course, than the origins of the US, when this kind of activity was limited to white property owning males. All residents are called to this. Responsibility. This statement reminds us that as much as we like to complain, and sometimes should be complaining about what's happening in government, we have a responsibility to make government function well. It's on us to be a part of the solutions for this. This sentence goes on that when it seems that we want to walk away, our job is, or our role is not to abandon our democracy, right? But to engage it. And so there's a challenge in that, because there are certainly times I am not looking at the paper this election season, turning off the radio. I just want to break from all of it. But we are overall called to this engagement and active participation, because what does it say? This is a calling from God, expressed in the discipleship described in our baptismal promises. Civic engagement and our ELCA civic engagement guide, we'll look at that a little later. It says civic engagement means working to make a difference in the civic life of our communities and developing the knowledge, skills, values, and motivation needed to make that difference. It means promoting the quality of life in a community through both political and non-political processes. Civic engagement is simply when we move out of our personal, intimate sphere into the public to help shape the future. A democracy could not function without that, right? And so that we have to go into the public square to build relationships, make decisions, elect leaders who are responsive to the views and needs of the people, and then to hold them accountable. Let's pause for a minute and use your chat feature. Open up your chat. And can you write some examples of civic engagement you have engaged in your church or community? What are some examples of civic engagement? And Karen, would you be able to unmute and read those as they appear?
Well, I see voting and writing letters to the state and federal legislators. Someone's an election worker, working at the polls, city council meetings, school board, advocacy for women's health, helping to register voters, food pantry work, letter writing, Girl Scout leadership, writing. My church is a voting center during every election, and we are holding a letter writing party for God's work our hands. Community meals, inviting others to vote. Advocacy. Someone's a volunteer firefighter. Some have been part of a meeting at the Capitol. Some have met with candidates, took part in the church's Pride Parade activity, debating with civic leaders, inviting elected leaders to the congregation, mentoring, being part of a recovery team after a tornado, interfaith gathering on bridging divides, hosting 2 precincts during the elections, donating blood. This is a lovely list. Engaging with Indigenous government, Zonta Club advocacy for women, active in Sophia, and writing to political leaders. Thank you for the contributions keep coming. A land acknowledgement, using that at the start of each service. Church is a voting center, and writing to letters to state officials and to the president.
Wow. That is very impressive, and it might be going on. So we can take note and take heart of all the civic engagement that's happening, even if it's not a word you use to describe your volunteering or your service before, it is. And so in our social message, there is a list of some of the forms that civic engagement takes. That's the next slide, Karen. Sorry, making a toggle back and forth. Here are some of the examples there. Informed and regular voting. Participation in efforts such as the census, because we know the census participation and results determine so much of what happens in our communities, especially for poverty-focused programs that we care about. Going to attend public meetings like during August recess. Public service as government employees or in a public office. Lutherans hold public service in high regard. We have since the Reformation, and that is why we pray regularly for our elected leaders, and we honor their service as a vocation. It can be involvement in political parties and campaigns, advocacy about particular issues, volunteering, community organizing, and nonviolent protests. So, given your previous list, I don't think there's any of these that would have surprised you as being part of something that we would do in church or as part of a faith community. I think the interesting question, which of these do you wish you could do or would like to try to stretch yourself to do, either as an individual or a community, as we think about our civic engagement? Just a few quick pieces from some things that the social message on government and civic engagement goes into that you could spend some time with as a church or community. The first is Lutherans care about government because it is a gift of God intended for the safety and flourishing of human life. This may or may not be something you agree with all the time, so it can be a bit of a challenge for us, and we will really unpack this in session 4 when we'll get into more about government. The statement spends some time acknowledging there's a spirit of broad dissatisfaction, mistrust, protest, and even contempt of government in the United States. And we know from national polls that there's 17% of people in a recent Pew poll stated that they trust their state, federal, or local government, whereas 83% expressed that they had mistrust of one or all. So this is a very challenging time as we talk about government, as we move into election, because all of this, of course, informs our behavior and our attitudes. What the statement will unpack, and if you spend some time with it, this could be a whole discussion in an adult forum about our trust in government and why, but also the affirmation that we believe that God acts through government just as God acts through the church. That human sin can cause disruption, both in government and public life, as well as in church. We've seen it in both places. But that we are called to be constructive always, not to walk away from either, but to work towards the building up so that people can be served as needed. Next slide. This is just a really interesting section you could spend some time with, a whole bunch of lists of what government actually does that does serve us that we don't necessarily think about enough or think about together. Next slide. And then finally, that all residents of the United States, I think that's that same slide again, have a responsibility not to abandon, but to gauge, and that is a calling. Next slide. So here's another discussion question you could do with your adult ed or on Sunday. As a Christian, have you thought about how you yourself is sharing responsibility to make government better? And have you participated in government at state, federal, or local levels? So finally, want to just end or finish this section with baptism. We know the baptismal covenant as it finishes off to strive for justice and peace in all the earth, but really every step along it to, live with God's faithful people, to share the Lord's Supper, to follow the example of our Lord Jesus Christ. In our baptism really are the seeds of a public life. And we embrace this identity and reality. Luther described baptism as a daily dying and rising with Christ. We receive grace anew every morning. And we affirm that God's grace assures us that we die daily to sin, including the temptation of fixing our identity to a political position or an ideological stance, or anything that is short of attaching our identity to God's love and grace for us. And so that love and grace that claims us in baptism then flows from us to share that same love and compassion with our neighbors. That's at the core of our civic engagement. It's that vision of shalom. It's that grounding in the garden and that goal of shalom, of lion and lamb lying down, peace and plenty for all. And that our civic engagement through our baptism is one means by which God calls on us to be active there. So I'd like to invite Autumn to unmute and spend a little time in conversation, hearing about you and some of your experiences, convictions, and insights around the role of civic engagement for young adults in the church today.
Okay, yeah, thank you for having me, Amy, and everyone. My name is Autumn Byers, and I live, work, and am a church member in the Grand Canyon Synod in Tempe, Arizona. I go to University Lutheran Church and Lutheran Campus Ministry at Arizona State. And my computer is sending me notifications. Sorry about that. And I just finished up a year working as an advocacy fellow for the Lutheran Advocacy Ministry of Arizona. That fellowship program is run through World Hunger, because World Hunger is dedicated, of course, not just to filling people's bellies, but to deconstructing the systemic barriers that cause hunger in the first place. And a huge way that can be done is through public policy. We've kind of, touched on the ways that it is important to engage in public policy because it is a very direct thing impacting our communities and the lives of our neighbors. How many people here are familiar with Bread for the World? Okay, so some, yeah. So Bread for the World is another ecumenical Christian advocacy group started by a Lutheran. And they estimate that federal nutrition assistance is able to provide about 10 times as much support to hungry families as our churches and charities and food banks combined can. So that's a really good estimate that speaks to how important it is that our public policy is engaging with how it can best and most proactively help people, because when it can, it really can. Amy, do you want to ask me questions?
I have a couple questions for you for the next couple of minutes, Autumn, and you can already see Autumn brings a great leadership and conviction in her vocation that's been in advocacy and public witness in the church. So you've thought a lot about civic engagement in an election year and why it's important to young adults. What can you tell us that we might need to know about how young adults make those connections?
I get a lot of questions about young adults in the church. As a young adult in the church, not every fellow who participates in the program is Lutheran, but I am. And everyone from people in my congregation on up to church-wide ask about how do we engage young people better. And my answer, no matter the conversation, always in some way comes back to civic engagement. So I grew up in the Missouri Synod, which is, a group that is not always very open to discussing a lot of difficult topics. And when I was in college, I joined my ELCA Lutheran campus ministry. And part of the reason I sought out the ELCA is because I knew they were LGBT affirming. And to me, that was a pretty good litmus test of being willing to take on difficult topics and proactively think about the world we live in and the needs of our neighbors, right? The entire good news of the gospel is about caring and loving for each other, lifting each other up, building a community where no one has to go without, right? And I am so far from the only young adult who sought out the ELCA because it's a body that has taken stances. I think sometimes it can be very scary for churches to talk about policy or engage with civic discourse, or we even have just this last week, my very last week of my fellowship, I was talking to a church that decided they did not want to be a polling place because they just thought it was too controversial to bring into their congregation. But young adults feel the opposite. So many young adults are thirsting for a church that looks realistically at the world we live in. So I have friends. I have one friend who grew up in a completely atheist family. She found Christ while she was in high school, and when she moved across the country for college, her mom found her a church specifically that espoused these public and proactive values, and she read our social statements before deciding she wanted to join. And she thought, this is a church that tells me outright how they care for people, and I can get on board with that. I have another friend who left his church during college and joined our church specifically because we were a church that continued to enforce mask mandates and policies to protect each other, even though that was very controversial in some churches. And he thought, I need to go to a church that actually truly prioritizes caring for one another. And now he's our council president. So across the board, I see this in a million different ways at my church, but across the young adult area. Christianity in America is really shifting. It is no longer, it's not common anymore that all of your neighbors on your street are at church on Sunday morning. It's much less of a cultural expectation. And in some ways, I think this is good because it is allowing us to re-examine, why do we go to church? Do we go to church because all our neighbors are going to church? Or do we go to church because we have a connection with God and an obligation to our community? And I think young adults who are remaining in the church are really latching onto that. I hear so many people on my college campus, at club fairs, all of these things saying, we want a church that doesn't just talk the talk. We don't just want a church that grandstands about the importance of Christ, but then neglects the actual good news and neglects our neighbors and ignores unhoused folks when they need assistance and all of these things. And so civic engagement is what ties into all of this. Civic engagement is what says we care about the world we live in, we care about the neighborhoods our buildings are in, and we want to make the world better for all of our neighbors, not just the people in our doors. And that's the central tenet of this whole faith. And so I think a lot of young adults, if we're going to take the time to go to church, we want a church that is truly engaged in our world and engaged in these processes where we can help each other and serve each other. And civic engagement is as the Bread for the World findings tell us, civic engagement is a giant, giant way we can help make that happen.
Finally, what would you say to a congregation, or what would you ask a congregation or advise them that wants to get involved in the upcoming election, especially if they want to get young adults involved, but doesn't know where to start?
Yes, there are so many options. And that's something I really love about advocacy and so cherished about my fellowship working in my synod. Our advocacy office was right in our bishop's office. And so we had access to all of our congregations. And I loved it so much because every congregation is in a different spot, physically, geographically, political, demographic makeup wise. And so every church is going to want to start somewhere different. If, we're getting close to the election, so it might be a little late for this, depending on where you are, but hosting voting as a polling place or a voting location is always a great place to start, in my opinion. My church does it every single election cycle, and it started because our pastor 20 years ago just decided to call the county. This is a really great way to show your community that you're a resource for them, not just a building that exists next to them. And we've actually gained some members and students who came and voted and were like, oh, I didn't know you were here. And oh, you've got pride flags and a food pantry and all these things. I want to come back. We always engage a little bit extra. We put out a welcome cart. And so we give out snacks and water to everyone who comes to vote and all the people who work in the polls. And it's just a great community building outreach thing. And that's really simple. The county does almost all of the work for that. We just need to buy snacks in a cart. Another really simple way is just to make resources available. These are things that are all nonpartisan. We just want to see people voting their conscience, right? Voting for your neighbor, voting for all of the things that Christ asks us to follow. And we don't want to get partisan because that, as Amy was talking about, can very much become a form of idolatry and not to mention just difficult in our congregations. But I was speaking to one church last week that set up a table in all of their worship locations that just has all of the information on candidates and polling places and all of those things that you can find right on your county website, as well as voter registration forms. Things like this can be really simple ways that people know you're a resource without having to build a whole, structure or have a civic engagement ministry. We also have, I guess, this isn't a state or a synod where you have an advocacy office, of course, but our federal office has so many resources that I would really suggest checking out. I'm sure that will be touched on over these next 4 weeks. But some of my favorite things we've put together this year include a checklist that can go up in your bulletin boards, in your announcements on your website, that just fills out all the information about your nearest polling location and the ID laws in your state. And that we put it up on our bulletin boards so that every Sunday people can check it and just have that little reminder to vote and to check out the important information about the process. We also have some really lovely conversation starters that I think are great just for forum hours when you're sharing coffee, to get folks talking about, oh yeah, the first time I voted, it was 2020 and it was very exciting, and all of those things. And so there are some really gentle ways that our church already has prepared to start the process without having to go big. And I would really encourage, talk to your councils, talk to your other lay members, talk to your pastor and say, this is something that matters to me. And I know that it's something that matters to us as a church. So let's take stock of where we are and see what small things we can do.
Autumn, you have set things up beautifully for making a segue to sharing some resources. But thank you for bringing, not just enthusiasm, but I think some deep background in working with congregations and exciting them. And I hope you all can feel Autumn's excitement, which is contagious, for really how our discipleship can take these election year opportunities to witness to our faith, to witness to Christ, and to help our neighbors so that all voices are heard. So thank you so much, Autumn. Appreciate you. Karen, if we could start with the slide on politics. I want to define a few terms. I want to look at what the IRS says, and then I want to get to some resources that I hope will be helpful for you in the time ahead. While Karen's getting the slide, I'll say I was in conversation with a woman last week who was doubtful whether her congregation would tolerate or embrace any kind of election year activity. And then she said, wait a minute, we actually have a drop box in our parking lot. She said, maybe, what if we start praying, as part of our church for the election and for, good outcomes and that everyone participate. She said, that's something we could do because we already have this. So, when Autumn said, start the process, go small, you don't have to go big right away. There's so many ways to do it. Next slide, please, Karen. So I was recently in an adult ed class in a congregation, and they were discussing politics in the church. And what the pastor noted then and observed back about the conversation is that many people were using the words politics and partisan negatively and interchangeably. And they were using to describe nasty, destructive, despicable behavior. And so I just want to take a breath and, just as a reminder, they are not the same thing, or at least in the origin of their words. So politics comes from the Greek word polis, means city or where people gather. And as used here, and as I'll be using it, politics it's the decisions we make. It's how we live in community. It's how we negotiate the common good. It's not a dirty word. We do politics when we elect our council members, for goodness sake, or set next year's budgets. And so representing that politics in and of itself is not a problem, or should not be for us. It's part of our life together. The word partisan, however, has become problematic in this country. Strong loyalty, sometimes blind obedience to a group or a party or faction or set of beliefs. And that takes particular forms in the US with our parties. Whereas nonpartisan is working in a way that is free from party affiliation, bias, or designation. We know we're in a time of hyper partisanship right now in this country. If you just say whether you prefer Fox News or MSNBC, you're already labeled by all sorts of different preferences, including where you live, if you're urban or rural, what your what region of the country you live in. There's all sorts of ways that we are pegging one another, and we have just seen the rancor, the deep mistrust, and even the fear that's expressed from whether you're Democrat or Republican towards members of the other party. And there's all sorts of ways that's been measured. We're not going to take time to get into this now. But as Lutherans, as members of churches, as members of faith institutions, we focus on the art of being nonpartisan in election year as churches and individuals. As individuals, we can choose to be part of a party, we can volunteer, we can door knock, we can put on the bumper stickers and everything. But as the church, as congregations and synods, and as ELCA church-wide organization, we discern and practice ways of being, as it says, transparent, nonpartisan, and legal in an election year, keeping within IRS boundaries, which is the next slide. So, according to the IRS, all 501c3 organizations are absolutely prohibited from directly or indirectly participating in, intervening in any political or campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for elective office. What this means is noncompliance with the tax code here could cost a ministry its tax-exempt status. If for rostered leaders here, for congregation leaders here, we must ensure that any activities that we engage in around the electoral process is transparent, nonpartisan, and legal. and to abide by the law. We have a guide, both in the ELCA Civic Engagement Guide and then another handout on abiding by the law that's there for your instruction. There also may be Michigan-specific resources that your Synod office has available for you. Next. So the ELCA document on being a public church, guidance for churches and clergy participating in the electoral process, details what is permissible and non-permissible. Can we go back? So for permissible items, the list is here. We're not going to go through it exhaustively, but that taking care that everything you do is nonpartisan when you encourage voting, when you do voter education, or when you engage in civic participation. You can help facilitate debates and public discussions, but there always needs to be equal opportunity so that representatives of the different sides, parties, and groups are going to be able to invited and able to speak. Same thing goes with get out the vote campaigns, registration guides. You can do all of that. The longer list is what's not permissible, and I would invite you to become conversant with this list. This has to go from anything from making contributions to allowing candidates to raise funds on your church's property, website, newsletter, or other publications. Any kind of hint of an endorsement or indirect endorsement, supporting a candidate. Political signs on the lawn of the church could be well construed as support for that candidate. And even how you focus your voter registration and other election year engagement. This guide will offer you some more insights into how to judge that. Again, the list goes on. Number 9 is interesting, asking a candidate to pledge support for your denomination's position on an issue. Much as we'd love to know, that is a no-no. Or providing any kind of in-kind support for candidates without equal access of the opposition. So this is available for you. There may be some more guidance from your Synod office as well. And if you ever do have a question about something, connect with your Synod office, and there's a Synod lawyer as well who could probably provide some extra insight. Next slide. In the ELCA Civic Engagement Guide, which you'll be provided with a link to at the end of this, there's a lot of resources there, more than I'm going to go in now, but there's tip sheets that you may want to consult that can give you guidance for particular ways of being involved. The first is how to conduct a voter registration guide, how to find out what are the rules for doing that in my area, what are the deadlines. This is going to differ from state to state and even county to county within a state. Once you get all this information, you can then engage in this as yourself or in collaboration, sometimes with other faith or other organizations. Candidate forums, again, there's guidance on this about how to do this in a nonpartisan way. That's something to study quite closely in guidance with in alignment with the IRS regulations. What we really recommend is if you want to do a candidate forum, find out if you can partner with an organization that's already been doing this, that knows the ropes, whether it's a nonpartisan organization that's been doing it, local ones in your community. League of Women Voters has often been a good partner in some places to be able to do this. There are different ways to do voting pledges. Last week we had a advocacy engagement equipping call, and we heard from in Virginia this effort called 100% voting congregations, and these were congregations making a pledge to say we're going to do everything we can to have 100% either of our membership or of certain parts of our community to have 100% voting. That's pretty ambitious, but it's a wonderful commitment to try to live into. So there's some how-tos on that. And then there's some more guidance on how to do get out the vote initiatives. There's plenty of time between now and election day to learn about doing canvassing or providing transportation to polls, or how to do calls and reminders. As Autumn said, we have a really nice resource on that you can customize to your
We do.
to your local area around where's your polling place, what are the hours, what kind of ID do you need or not need, and so you can fill that out as a fillable form online and distribute it, post it, share it. How to reach out in hard to reach communities, people without addresses, people in high-rise buildings. We do have a resource sheet on helping people who are unhoused, who are homeless, to access the ballot, which requires some specific steps, but which could be a great service. And how to lower barriers, again, for communities who have been disenfranchised or denied the vote. And churches as purveyors, as sources of trusted information in the community, we really have an important role to play in getting that information out, so that people can know what their choices are, and what they can, what they're going to be able to do. A couple other resources. Does being a Christian impact how you vote? Well, let's find out. Some congregations we find are very hesitant to talk about voting. One way to come in kind of in a soft entrance would be to start with our youth, with these intergenerational conversation starters, where youth members interview members of voting age about what does your faith, what was the first time you voted? What was that like? Tell that story, and then say, how has your faith informed how you vote? Very simple. There's some testimonies from people who've done this on the sheet. It's a wonderful way to talk without ratcheting up the heat of the election itself. Also, does being a Christian impact how you vote? Well, as Lutherans, we certainly believe it guides us. And so there are some Bible studies that are available on civic life and engagement, different aspects of thinking about how we vote, that can help us steward that resource. But again, for people for whom talking about the election itself can be a high bar, we come at it through our reflection about our common and community life in Scripture. We also know within this country, there is a long and shameful history of denying the ballot, removing the ballot, making the ballot hard to access for different communities, especially on racial grounds. And as we have some specific calls as Lutherans to be part of dismantling these barriers and obstacles, and we have a voter suppression information and learning resource that you could use to talk about it. The resource we get asked for the most, though, around elections, or maybe even all the time, is how do we even talk as Lutherans, as people of faith, as people in the same church community around issues, around community concerns when we know we hold opposite views. And so while there's quite a few different resources for that, we have a new one on our blog from the Interfaith America Faith and Elections Playbook, Addressing Polarization and Building Cohesion in Community. Next week, our second session will be on polarization and how to be depolarizers. But here's an article to get you started about how do we begin to knit back together some of the strands of community that have been frayed over time. How do we begin to dial down some of the rhetoric and be leaders, models, and people who do this as part of our calling, our discipleship. Finally, or almost finally, we have an ELCA Election Activator Network. What is that? This is an opportunity for anyone here to sign up to be an election activator. The only entrance fee required is to sign a pledge that anything you do in the congregation will be nonpartisan for the reasons mentioned previously. The network, we're doing monthly Zoom calls for equipping, for new resources, for idea sharing, for conversation. We're finding many of the people who sign up for this activator network feel very alone in their congregations. They want something to happen. They think it's important that the church should be discussing the election and finding some way to encourage involvement. They don't, but they're just looking for a place to start and a supportive community. So with that QR code, you can sign up, or in the link that will come out afterwards. Finally, where do you find all these resources? Well, on the ELCA website for the elca.org/civic engagement, or at elca.org votes, or in the Resource Center. Many of the things and more live, but we are also going to be sending them out after this. Oh, thank you. We are actually exactly at 8 o'clock. We're to stop and have some conversation. We may have come a long way from Shalom, the Imago Dei, of being uniquely gifted by God for relationship, for loving our neighbor, through caring for the community. But these resources and tools are part of that equipping and supporting what you are doing. We love to hear from Lutherans who are doing civic engagement, what you're seeing and learning, and also hearing what support could you need. And so this is our time to, I think, open things up and find out a little more about who's here, what's on your mind, what else we can do together. Thank you.
Okay, so if you do have questions, feel free to enter those in the chat. Okay, it looks like we have, if I'm understanding this correctly, we have a question about taking positions on proposals and propositions, and if that is something that's okay, or if that would be something that congregations cannot do.
That is something that you can do because they're not aligned with the party. There may be partisan takes on them, but they're not aligned with a party stance. And so to conduct education, I think is within the realm of what congregations can do. Just don't bring in one candidate to talk about them.
Since there are no questions and since I don't write in the chat, I'm going to ask one. Is that okay?
Sure.
So, Pastor Amy, today is Tuesday, and God's Work, Our Hands is Sunday. And so say I'm a congregational leader leaving this class really excited and wanting to do something, wanting my church to do something in, 5 days? What could we do?
Actually, Karen, would you like to handle that? Because she has created some resources for God's Work, Our Hands Sunday.
I did not set that up.
Yeah, I'd actually be glad to. I was trying to pull up the link as the question was posed. There is you've probably seen the ELCA God's Work Our Hand toolkit, and in the toolkit there's an advocacy section, and we do suggest that maybe some kind of civic engagement in this election year might be of interest to you. There's a couple of ideas, as well as connections to state public policy office networks and others who might have information. And there's a template letter too for congregations who might be involved in some kind of direct service activity and want to think about some of the systemic issues that they could speak to in conjunction with that activity. So I'll share those resources here. Thank you for raising the question.
Yeah, and I'll say we've proposed but not been persevered yet in maybe it could be God's Work, Our Hands, Our Voices Sunday, because we have for several years included an advocacy action as part of the toolkit, knowing many congregations work on hunger or housing, and there's always something happening in DC, decisions being made or at the state level that would impact access to food, affordable housing, reduce homelessness. And so we can go out and serve with our hands, but then there are ways we also serve through our voices. In an election year, this is one other way. I will say also, it's really rooted in our theology, the suggestion that, could you use God's Work, Our Hands Sunday to also thank your legislators? We often don't say thank you clearly enough. And because as Lutherans, we honor the vocation to public service, to take an intentional time and say thank you for the things that you can say thank you for, honoring their service and really giving encouragement at a time when we hear from many public servants, it's a very hard time to serve.
Great. It looks like we do have a question about how things are communicated. I think maybe from Advocacy or Witness in Society, do you have like a blog or anything that would be helpful for people to follow to get information on what's going on?
We put out, we have a blog, and there's a blog page for this election season on election engagement, and it grows. There are new things added to it all the time as new resources become available. I would say we're punching above our weight in some ways this year. We've really put out a lot of new resources in response to incredible interest, curiosity, demand from congregations, leaders around the country. There's things we haven't mentioned here, like worship resources for a national election. We have a handout on that with some beautiful prayers. And so that's one place to just bookmark and look at. If you're in the Election Activators Network, that group is going to hear first about everything when resources are sent out. Then there's our Connections is the name of our newsletter that goes out monthly. So for those who subscribe to our alerts or who sign up for the network, you do get all the action alerts on different issues, as well as then a monthly, really rundown. Here's the latest on the issues that we're currently pursuing. Here are some of our latest resources. Here are upcoming events. So that is once a month. We try not to send out too many things. You can tell us if we are.
All right, I'm not seeing any, so we can wrap up a little bit early. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful introduction for our series. We're very much looking forward to everything else, and thank you all so much for coming.